Look closely at the remote edges of Box Elder County, Utah. It is a harsh, windswept stretch of high desert, roughly 200 miles northwest of Salt Lake City, a place of deep, almost total isolation. People who travel into this terrain usually do so because they want to remain unseen. 19-year-old Dylan Rounds was an exception. He arrived in this barren landscape near the tiny community of Lucin with a very clear, highly visible ambition. He wanted to build a farm. Dylan split his childhood between Idaho Falls and Twin Falls. His family always knew agriculture would be his path. At 17, he partnered with his grandfather to purchase his own tract of land in Utah, setting his sights on turning a patch of dry dirt into a working operation. He spent 2 consecutive summers preparing the soil. He cleared the acreage by hand. He lived most nights inside a camper parked right on the property, entirely off the grid, without running water. By the spring of 2022, the preparation was complete, and he was days away from planting his first crop. The surrounding desert was an intimidating, empty expanse to outsiders. For Dylan, the isolation offered a blank slate of absolute potential. On Saturday, May 28, 2022, Dylan spoke with his grandmother on the phone. A heavy rainstorm was rolling into the valley, and he told her he had to cut the call short to move his seed truck into the shed. That brief exchange was his final communication. Monday arrived. Dylan missed his scheduled check-ins with his family. His mother, Candace Cooley, immediately drove to the remote property and found only silence. Her son was missing, but his seed truck was parked right on the farm. It was unnervingly clean. Someone had power washed the exterior. Inside, the seats had been adjusted, pushed back into a position Dylan never used. Despite the torrential rain that swept through the valley over the weekend, the mud immediately surrounding the truck remained smooth. There were no tire tracks leading into or away from the vehicle. The evidence on the ground suggested a deliberate, methodical cleanup. The teenager and his tracks had been systematically scrubbed from the dirt. A massive search operation mobilized across Box Elder County. Over 30 different law enforcement agencies scoured the unwatched wilderness, turning up miles of empty brush. They also found James Brenner. Brenner was 58 years old, squatting in a trailer a few miles away from the farm. Dylan had known he was there. In fact, Dylan had hired Brenner to help bale hay and allowed the older man onto his property to eat at his table. Brenner carried a violent history. In the 1980s, he had shot a man at a Maryland campground over a work dispute, a felony conviction that legally prohibited him from possessing any firearm. Looking at a map of the Lucin area, the scale of the danger becomes immediately clear. For miles in any direction, the only 2 occupied dots in the desert were Dylan's farm and Brenner's trailer. The remoteness of the property drew both men for entirely opposing reasons. It provided Dylan with cheap, vast land to cultivate. It provided Brenner with a blind spot, shielded from the scrutiny of law enforcement. Dylan had built his sanctuary far away from the safety of neighbors, inadvertently trapping himself in isolation with a violent offender. The methodical cleanup at the farm eventually unraveled. Searchers investigating the property found a pair of Dylan's boots discarded and hidden behind a pile of dirt. One of the boots had a visible bloodstain. Forensic investigators tested the material and matched the DNA to Dylan. They also found a second DNA profile on the very same boot. It belonged to Brenner. As investigators processed the blood, a local neighbor came forward. He reported that shortly after Dylan vanished, Brenner arrived at his door, desperate to hide an unserialized .22 caliber rifle and 3 black powder guns. The FBI seized the weapons, and Brenner was arrested on federal firearms charges. Then, investigators located Dylan's missing cell phone. Inside the phone's storage, they uncovered a time-lapse video. The footage captured James Brenner aggressively cleaning a gun. Across his arms and his shirt, deep red stains were clearly visible. The shirt was recovered, tested, and came back positive for Dylan Rounds' blood. The teenager used his phone to document the progress of his agricultural dream. That same device captured the immediate aftermath of his murder. In March 2023, based on the blood, the boots, and the video, prosecutors charged James Brenner with aggravated murder. But Dylan's family faced a grueling legal reality. They had video evidence of a killer washing their son's blood off a weapon, but the vast desert still concealed his remains. Brenner sat silently in custody. For nearly 2 full years, Dylan's parents endured the specific, agonizing torture of knowing exactly who killed their son while being entirely unable to bring his body home. 23 months passed. The silence finally broke in April 2024. Prosecutors negotiated a plea agreement, offering Brenner a reduction in charges in exchange for one single piece of information: the exact coordinates of the burial site. Brenner accepted the deal. He walked investigators directly into the wilderness near Lucin, forcing the landscape to yield the secret it had kept. On the desolate border between Utah and Nevada, the FBI recovered skeletal remains. Dental records confirmed it was Dylan. Forensic analysis established the brutal truth of his final moments: a single gunshot wound to the head. Brenner formally pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. For shooting a 19-year-old and hiding his body for 2 years, the justice system handed James Brenner a minimum sentence of just 3 years in prison. At the sentencing hearing, Dylan's father, Justin, stood in the courtroom. He spoke about his son hauling sugar beets and potatoes, and the meal shared on a remote farm where kindness was scarce. He asked the room how a man repays that level of generosity with a bullet. Today, the wind blows quietly across an unplanted farm in Box Elder County. The sprawling geography of the Utah desert remains exactly as it was, unchanged, indifferent, having silently absorbed the brightest ambitions of a young farmer and the darkest cruelty of the man he trusted.